Hi, welcome to our next session, and in this session we shall look at conceptual understanding of development and its dimensions. So basically, we are trying to define what development is. Yeah, in the previous session, we talked about development studies and how evolving it has been since the 1940s onwards, and of course the evolution of development studies is also um, uh, related to the actual definitions or changes in the definitions of development and its dimensions. So that's what we're going to focus on in this session. So let's begin. So, of course, to understand development, mostly the changes in development processes is looked at or measured in terms of physical or quality of life. Of course, following the implementation of certain policies or programs or interventions that can be implemented or designed by different actors, and therefore, but of course, we also have to note that such interventions and such changes happen amidst many different factors that would otherwise also, of course, influence how such changes would happen. So there is no single definition. So the meaning of development has relatively been changing since the 1940s. After World War II, that's basically when the concept of development started. And the definition has been changing over time. Of course, the changes are relatively from one person to another, or from time to time, or from place to place. Excuse me. And therefore we have all different thoughts of what development is. Each of us, each individual, has their own ways of defining development. Of course, depending how it operates, what it does, and its ultimate goals, and what it is. Because each of us also have different thoughts on where we want to be or what kind of changes we want in our lives. So that's the quality of life I'm talking about, or whatever goods and services we would want to produce, make some changes at individual level or household level, or whatever level it is. So that's what makes it something that has different definitions. So there is no universal definition of development. But of course, to understand this overwhelming concept, we rely on how things have been happening before and what is happening right now. And then, of course, depending also on the proposals that are being established based on a combination of historical or current perspective or happenings. And therefore, people try to make theories and models and definitions of how things should be or how things are. So some interesting books that you may need to engage. Yeah, we have this, which we have so far dubbed our Bible for this course unit for Introduction to Development Studies, and so you could engage that. There is one also by Todaro and Smith, basically talking about economic development, and in a moment we're going to look at how development from one dimension is equated to development. There is also Guns, Germs, and Steel by Jared Diamond, and uh, it basically looks at the fates of human societies, looking at how societies have been changing or what led to having a dissection of developed versus developing countries, and some of the factors that have led to such changes. Excuse me. And then we also have another interesting book, an interesting book by Asemoglu and Robinson, and it looks at why nations fail. And at a later stage, we shall look at how things go. And of course, Asemoglu mainly looks at and Robinson mainly look at the institutions, the importance of institutions in development processes. Okay, so you can find these interesting. You'll have access to them and see how you can utilize them. So, what is development? So, development is dynamic, a dynamic cause of change, of course. Many definitions, like I've just talked about it in some minutes ago. We have different thoughts about what it is and so on. And of course, it changes over time as a result of economic, social, cultural, political, and human needs. So, like I said before, each of us has their own needs, and it's those needs that define how we think about development, and therefore how we define what development is. In the previous uh, session, I don't know, yeah, maybe that was another class, but I talked about the idea that you may have a pastoralist who has thousands of heads of cattle, but sleeps in a grass thatched house, um, and does not eat, in quotes, balanced diet, in quotes. Um, and one other person from an urbanized center might think that that pastoralist is poor, but the pastoralist indeed is looking at the many herds of cattle as a definition of development, as a definition of him being rich or her being rich. But then the person who is staying in the urbanized center is looking at this pastoralist based on what the urbanized person is using to measure what development is. Because for him, the one in the urbanized center thinks that or thinks or takes himself or herself staying in a mansion in an urban center, owning a car, having a job that is earning some money from employed job, uh, have studied. When they compare themselves with the other pastoralist who has not studied and stays in a grass thatched house but has cattle, the urban guy thinks that the other pastoralist is poor. But it's the same thought that the other pastoralist is having, because he thinks this urbanized guy, even if he stays in a mansion or owns a car, he does not own the very many heads of cattle that the pastoralists have. So this is what I'm talking about, that we have different thoughts about what development is, how it operates, what it does, and its ultimate goal. So the ultimate goal of the other pastoralist is to have as many heads of cattle as they can, and for them that is development, regardless of where they sleep or what they eat or whether they have studied. Also, the person in the urban center is also thinking about, okay, if I get another job and add on my earnings and maybe buy a plot of land in the urban center, that is okay with me, even if I don't own any livestock at home. So different thoughts, different ways of thinking of how development operates, and therefore different definitions of what development is. Okay. So, what then influences the definitions? So, according to VSO, there are three main three factors: perceptions, values, and beliefs, and then cultural values. So, our perceptions, so just think about what I just talked about, the pastoralist versus the urbanized guy. The perceptions are different, their perceptions are different. Of course, those have been influenced by where they stay, what they do, how they live, and so on. And that itself also is influenced by the values and beliefs and cultures, and the cultures, the different cultures. Okay, so that is different. So the urbanized guy could have been exposed to a Western world kind of culture, and therefore looks at those kind of things as uh, definitions of him being rich or her being rich, while the other pastoralists, according to their culture, values, and beliefs, and perceptions in general, those look at having many herds of cattle as being rich. Okay, so if you met a pastoralist like a Muhima person, would say, okay, no, if who are you to speak in public if you don't even own a single cow? Something like that. So perceptions, values, and beliefs. But of course, also the urbanized guy would say, okay, no, look at you. You stay in a grass such house. Yeah. But for I stay in a very luxury house, so I am richer than you. So such kind of differences in terms of perceptions, values, beliefs, and cultural values. Okay, so these are some of the factors that would influence the definitions of individuals in terms of defining what development is. So development has many meanings, and of course, the meaning a particular person attaches to the term depends on her or his subjective view of the world. How we view the world, how we perceive the world, defines how we define development. And of course, uh, the definition is not a product of just an individual's perception or perspective, but also the particular period in time or when the word is being uttered. The word development is being uttered. So those are how now differences in terms of definitions of development come in. So there are many different meanings of development. Of course, these are but a few. So, for instance, Chambers looks at development as a responsible well-being and as a web of interrelationship between equity or well-being or sustained livelihood, um, all those, or security. So that if you have security and you have achieved some good livelihood that you would sustain in terms of achieving needs, and therefore you have good well-being, and but of course also thinking about the idea that those are being achieved equitably, then in that case you have achieved development. Different from Myers, who looks at development from a Christian or biblical perspective aspect, that development is a transformation lifelong journey, that there are many needs or things that one must go through to achieve development, and therefore it's a long term achievement or transformation in terms of change, including not just economic or social or physical or psychological, but spiritual. So Myers also brings in the idea of having a spiritual growth, that you can attain any other kind of development, but if you are not spiritually upright or spiritually developed, then you are not developed. By spiritual, we are also talking about the idea of eliminating superstitions, where you find people have this negative, then have negative thoughts about some development processes and so on. So Myers thinks that if you have not attained all those, even if you are rich, if you have those negative thoughts, then you are, oh, for instance, believing in the spirit, in for instance, voodoo or juju or so, then you have not broke. Then the UNDP, that's United Nations Development Program 2000, equates development to human development, which relates to human rights. That for one to be developed, they must experience all sorts of human rights. The need, I mean, right to education, right to health, right to life, right to security, right to, and so on. All those basic needs that you can think of, and rights. Okay, so that is what the UNDP equates to development. Kaplan 2000 also thinks that development is a living process. A living process that just the way we see a child is um, is born and then grows and then becomes independent. So um, Kaplan thinks that that is how development is also. That, for instance, if you compares the child, for the child is born, and therefore the child has to depend on the parents or guardians or any kind of adults to attain some kind of livelihood or some good living. And then after sometimes when they have achieved some skills and so on, then they become independent and therefore they have now developed. So just the way you look at the child moving, okay, growing up, then you go to school, your parents give you money, and then you also go and achieve access health services and so on. And then after you become an adult, and then you use the knowledge and skills you gained, and then you can use those for your own development. So Kaplan says that development is also like a living process, that in that case, for instance, some countries are born and therefore they are helped to mature and develop and attain some skill, I mean, attain some kind of level of development, may be given foreign aid to be able to develop, and at a certain phase they become independent because they have enough services and goods, and they can have their own industries to manufacture goods and extract raw materials, and then they can now they can now use those to develop themselves further. So that's how Kaplan looks at it. Nabachwa 2006 looks at development as an interest relationship phenomenon. That look, while we talk about development from responsible well-being, transformational lifelong or rights or living process, development is about relationships between those who have and those who do not have. For instance, relationships between the developed countries in Europe or in US and the developing countries in Africa or Asia or South America. That it's an interest kind of relationship that the developed countries, for instance, have interest in whatever is happening in developing countries, but also those that are in developing countries have their own interest in dealing with those that are developed, and in that case, that is how development process happens. Todaro and Smith looks at development as a sustained elevation of good life. Sustained elevation of good life, that if, for instance, one achieves a certain need, then that need must be sustained and therefore used to have a good living. So that is how we get all these different definitions. Even you yourself have your own definitions on how you can look at what development is. completely different from what these guys have put forward as development. So we have broad and narrow definitions. So for instance, the narrow definition right from end of World War II, when the concept of development was thought about, the definition of development by then was relying on the classical economic theories, looking at production of goods and services, and therefore that if a certain country or society would produce enough goods and services to sustain its population, and therefore even export much more and sell it, then they would have attained development. And in that case, that is why, for instance, by then, the then President Roosevelt of the US, after World War II, proposed that the US would then help, for instance, the European countries that were devastated by World War II to get back up and then produce goods and services, and therefore they could again stabilize and do better. So that was the whole idea of the what they then called the Marshall Plan by the US to help the European countries. So specifically, development is seen as being about economic growth engineered by, of course, experts, mainly the economists. So in this case, the measure of development or human welfare is equated to economic growth, which is a measure of values of outputs of goods and services within a time period. And of course, it involves, for instance, measurements of national income. How much does the country produce in terms of money, in terms of income? Look what they look at the gross domestic product, the value of outputs of goods produced and services produced by a country during a certain period of time. Sorry, gross national product in terms of the value of output produced within a country, plus the net income from, of course, property abroad. How much those that own property abroad can bring in the country, but of course also measurements of per capita income, or how much does each person earn or produce in terms of income. Okay, so all these are measurements of economic growth, and if the higher you have in terms of these measurements, the more developed you are. But of course, that has a problem when we focus more on goods and services or income. Then that has a problem, because using measures of those of economic growth gives a marred picture, or an incomplete picture of what constitutes certain development processes. Because if, for instance, if we measure economic growth in terms of gross domestic product or goods and services, or what a country has in terms of income, to use it to say that, okay, if Uganda has a certain, maybe one is more than 3,000 GDP, gross domestic product, in terms of goods and services, then it is rich. Then in that case, we would be generalizing. That generalization gives a wrong picture, because you might find that for instance, now in Uganda, only 10%, or only like 90% of the goods and services, or the income that Uganda has, is actually produced by only 10% of the population. So in that case, the 10% of the rich would be actually supporting the biggest percent of national income or gross domestic product of Uganda. So in that case, the income distribution between the rich and the poor is not equally measured in term if we use economic growth as a measure. So in that case, you'll find that we are actually giving a wrong picture, that we have many poor people in Uganda and very few rich people. But then we are using the other generalized picture of saying that Uganda is rich, and yet it is indeed a poor country. So, two, the other problem of using economic growth measure, that we miss the quality of life, because the changes in economic growth do not necessarily mean the changes in the quality of life. Or does the additional earnings of power bring with it additional stress, increase in working hours, or increase in family problems? So all those are issues. Or are the goods and services distributed equally? All those are questions that we might ask ourselves when we are using economic growth to equate it to development as in general. Because, for instance, okay, you have a woman, let's say a woman who is staying in a household that is earning much more, or it is rich, but this woman has no right to own any property in that household. This woman cannot earn her own income by herself, because she depends on the house, the husband as a provider of the household. This woman cannot engage with other women or other community members, is not allowed to go and interact with other community members in the community. This woman might even be beaten with, or battered, or she's experiencing gender-based violence or violence against women. So all those are missed measures, or this woman does not even actually is not educated. So all those are missed measures of development if we look at development as in terms of economic growth, in terms of goods and services or income levels. Okay, so those are some of the problems with measuring economic growth as development. Then also, what about the informal economy? There are some activities that are not recorded or measured, including their effects on population. For instance, unpaid household work and community charitable work. There is so much that people are involved in. For instance, take up, if you go to a certain community which is more traditional, you'll find more men participating in paid work and participating less in unpaid work, and you find women participating more in unpaid work versus rather than paid work. So that becomes that becomes difficult to generally say that, okay, that particular community is developed, but yet some people, especially women who are more involved in unpaid work, are not earning as much as men would earn. Okay, so youth versus the elderly. So there are different factions that of measurements that would be missed. Okay, so again, validate the problems with measuring development as economic growth. So if we define development in terms of economic growth, so what about personal capabilities, or deprivation? That, for instance, there are some skills or knowledge that are untapped. For instance, that woman who is more engaged in household work rather than the economic work. What about the environment, the infectious diseases? If we only concentrate on economic growth, for instance, right now we are looking at the pandemic. What about such issues if we concentrate on goods and services? What about the public and collective goods? For instance, the land that is owned communally and so on. What about the relationships or relational? For instance, can a person appear in public without shame? Or because they are poor, therefore they cannot appear in public? What about household, at household level, the power relations I was talking about? For instance, the the productive activities that are not counted, or reproductive or community activities that are not counted. For instance, so you have this example, the unpaid care work. This is taken from the Uganda Bureau of Statistics and Ministry of Gender 2019. The figure is showing average weekly number of hours spent on unpaid care work by age group, 15 years, 5 years and above. So this is the this is quantitative data from 2012, 2013, and the year 2016, 2017. So you have weekly hours on your y-axis, and then you have the gender differences, the males and females for both years. 2012, 2013, and 2012, 2016, 2017. So you have, for instance, in 2012 and 2013, you have, for instance, women on average spend more hours doing unpaid work compared to men. But also, if you factor in the age differences, you will find that women who are between 18 and 30, and therefore more can have more energy to work, and they are of course more engaged in marriage, therefore doing care work and domestic. Think of housewives. Women who are between 18 and 30 work more compared to women of other of other age groups. Okay, so you also see that, but by 2016, that kind of working has reduced, but again you still find that women would still be more engaged in unpaid care work, such as taking care of children, taking care of sick, doing household chores like cooking and so on. Okay, compared to men. Of course, things might have changed depending on the other factors, such as maybe education, desensitization. Women are now more into schools and have joined workforce, and therefore can work and so on. Okay, so they are all different factors, and this takes us to the point that I was talking about, that the definition of development or measures of development also change from time to time, period to period, and depending on different factors. So there are many factors that have led to these changes from 2012, 2013 to 2016, 2017. Okay, so you will see that, for instance, also in 2016, 2017, there are now more men engaged in unpaid work compared to those who were in 2012. So there are changes that have been happening, but still, the point was that if we do measure economic development in terms of economic growth, and there are many problems or validity problems, or there are many problems that are with such measurements that we miss out. Okay, so the problems with general surveys is that we do issues of sampling and quantitative and qualitative, and then we miss out some individual factors or individual measures that would have given us a bigger or better picture of what development is for individuals, households, or national level. Okay, so therefore, with time, there have been shifts in terms of definitions and in terms of measurements. So at first, it was more of economic growth, and therefore economic-based measures. And then we moved towards looking at equitable based measurements, and therefore looking at human development measures. And then also looking at now not just looking at the humans in general, but also looking at the differences in terms of gender. What about we don't just look at uh, people in the household, but we also look at them from the gender perspective. So therefore measuring the differences in terms of development between men and women, or boys and girls. So there are differences in terms of definitions and measurements that have been happening over a period of time, right from measuring in terms of goods and services, but then towards looking at equitable kind of measurements. Okay, so from narrow definitions to multiple definition. The narrow definition, remember, economic growth, goods and services equals to development. But then we have now more open definitions, and therefore looking at the multi-dimension or multidimensionality of development. So looking at definition, equating development as in terms of poverty reduction, decreasing inequalities, promoting equality and equity, well-being or happiness, or the good society, including democratic politics, whether voting is fair or unfair, and then sustainable planet in terms of climate change and environmental protection, and so on. But of course, the more broader looks at the transformational change, which also looks at the other dimensions of economic, social, political, and culture. And therefore, those shifts now have looked at a drawing board has changed from looking at just uh, goods and services, but now looking at development with a human face. Development with a human face, meaning that we just jump out of looking at development, just looking at how many goods or how many cars does a person have, or how many houses, or how many plots of land, towards looking at now development in terms of, for instance, how educated are they, or how many do they access health services? Are they happy? Are they equally accessing those services that they are supposed to access? That's the human face we are talking about. So here you have, for instance, Fukuda par 2 and 3 gives this dissection of economic growth versus human development, and therefore showing us the how economic growth can sometimes be limited to other aspects of human development. For instance, you will see that economic growth just looks at the utility of goods and services, and therefore satisfaction in that case. But human development looks at functionings and capabilities, anything that a person would can be, in life, or what they can do or be. Okay, so economic growth, if we means that looks at human resources, for instance, for economic activity, but the human development looks at the ends in terms of who benefits, how do they benefit, who participate in such in such ways of trying to benefit. So looks at that aspect. The economic growth also looks at the economic development also looks at individual action, but the human development aspect measures the individual action, but also collective action in terms of people working together towards achieving certain things. So there are many conditions that would propel economic growth, such as economic people's knowledge in terms of skills and knowledge, that is capital. Think about your basic economics. Then efficient use of human capital, such as land or money, also or skills, and then sound economic policies that would therefore encourage industrialization and production of goods and services. But that is different from what human development looks at, because for it looks at, in addition to the economic aspects. It also looks at education services, human services, democracy, environmental protection, and so on. Okay, so uh, that is what we mean by a shift from looking at development from economic growth towards looking at development from, I mean, wholesomely in terms of even or other dimensions. So therefore, development is multidimensional. It does not only look at economic growth. That is just one dimension. It looks at other dimensions: politics, social, psychological, and now human development aspects in terms of quality of life. Okay, so this is why we have all these different dimensions. That development is contextual. It varies from place to place, time to time, individual to individual. It is amorphous. It has multiplicity in terms of what constitutes development. Again, think about how we all define what development is. So we can look at development in terms of economic development, goods and services. We can look at development in terms of social development, look at health, if you are healthy or if you are educated. Could look at development in terms of politics, in terms of whether the country or leadership processes are democratic or non-democratic. Okay, if you can vote or don't vote, or whether the government is dictatorial or democratic. Okay, think of those. Then you could look at administrative in terms of institution. How are institutions in terms of norms and rules and policies? How are they in terms of guiding how people should behave or not, or how they control organizations or people? Then human development, as what we just talked about, quality of life, or what someone can be or do in terms of rights, in terms of capabilities. Then sustainable development in terms of we can look at development in terms of what the current population is using or achieving and what the future generations would be able to use. So sustainable development in terms of sustainable development in simple terms looks at the idea that to what extent we, the current generations, uh, achieving development, but also making sure that we preserve resources for the other coming generations to benefit from those needs and resources. Okay, that's sustainable development goal. I mean, sustainable development. So you can see that development can be looked at from different angles. So look at dimension. When I mention dimension, just think about different ways or different angles that you can look at development. Okay, so again, using the other example of the pastoralist versus the urbanized guy. The urbanized guy would be looking at the cars and owning what vehicles, as that is economic development. Or the pastoralist is looking the many cattle, the many heads of cattle that he has. That is economic development. Okay, many. Okay, in terms of goods and services. But then we could look at where they sleep or whether they are educated. So the urbanized guy is more socially developed because he's educated, while the other one is not educated. And the urbanized guy can also access better services in the urban center, which are not sometimes not good in rural areas. Okay, but in terms of social and collective culture kind of development, the other pastoralists could be also developed in terms of culturally rich and so on, because the guy in the urban center is living an individualistic way of life. So there are so many different ways. In terms of political development, the pastoralist could be living under the kinship kind of way, that they are traditional leaders who who lead lead that community. There is nothing like voting. What the king says is what you follow. But in the urban center, it could be that this person is can make their own decisions however they want to make those decisions. So those are all different ways of looking at development in a multi-dimensional way. So the narrow definition dimensions, again, economic growth, you have economic income and so on. Then you have uh, narrow dimensions of social development. For instance, I've just talked about peasantry to modern social change in terms of life. Then you have social mobilization over time, culture change, and then social services, education, housing, and so on. And also freedoms and choices. Okay, for instance, social roles between men and women. Then again, narrow dimensions, you have the political development, political systems in terms of responding to people's needs. Is the government responding to what the people need? If the people are saying that, look, we don't have electricity, we don't have roads, how is the government responding? Or are people voting for their leaders or not? The other narrow dimension is administrative, or human development or sustainable development in terms of environmental protection, or people's needs, or don't run out of resources, meet the current development needs, but don't compromise the needs of the future generations. All these are narrow dimensions. Now, the broader dimensions are that we could look at development as a process, patterns of change. So patterns of change could be in terms of all these narrow dimensions. Okay, development as a process. Okay, the processes can change in terms of politics, in terms of human, in terms of development, in terms of social development or economic development. We could look at development broadly as a project in terms of policies and strategies or interventions that are aimed at creating certain changes, or certain processes of changes. So it could be a project, therefore takes some time. So think about what, for instance, in Uganda, for instance, now the government has moved from operational wealth creation. Last time, I think last year, they were looking at Emyoga. Now they are looking at all those kinds of projects that the government puts across. Or think about those community projects that you have in your own countries or in your own communities that your leaders have put forward or your community members have put forward to make sure they lead a better life. Okay, that is broadly how we can look at development. But of course, in those projects that you're thinking about, all those policies that you're thinking about that your national governments have put forward are all leading to changes in these narrow dimensions. Okay, so that's what I mean. You could also look at development as a project broadly, as knowledge, an object of knowledge broadly. Theories of development as an outcome of processes and projects. Okay, so this is what I mean. Also, for instance, development as a discourse. Development it could be looked at as short. It can happen in a short period of time. It can happen in medium term or long term, and of course, all these measurements can be done in that way. Okay, so you could look at development as a long-term process. This is what I just talked about here. Okay, long-term process in terms of changes in those other narrow dimensions. Of political, social, economic, cultural, human, sustainable, and so on. Or development as a short or to medium term outcome of desirable targets. What, for instance, is needed to be achieved. So, for instance, in 2000, the UN countries, member state design millennium development goals, and they were set to be achieved by 2015. That maybe by 2015 they should have each country should have reduced poverty levels by 75%. That was a target, short and mid-term targets. And for some countries achieved them while others did not. But so now in 2015, then the end of Millennium Development Goals led to the initiation of Sustainable Development Goals, which are 17 now, that lead to the agenda of 2030. And each of these 17 Sustainable Development Goals has its own targets, different sub-targets, and all those are desirable targets. And therefore, each country must meet those, but also globally, those must be met. Okay, so it's like a project, or but of course process, a combination of different outcomes, different desirable outputs that are needed to be achieved. But of course it can also be looked at as a discourse of Western modernity, therefore that we look at development as something that the Western world, such as America or Europe, is trying to bring about in our countries, or for instance continent of Africa. Okay, so simply put, this is a summary that we could look at, that basically looks at what development is. It's a process from a certain, it happens from a certain stage to another stage. Those who have done economics, I'm sure you've looked at the Rostow's stages of economic growth, from traditional to takeoff, to precondition to takeoff stage. Usually you hear, for instance, the Ugandans, usually you hear your president talking about that Uganda is now on takeoff. Okay, then stage of drive to maturity, then stage of high mass consumption. So it's a process, doesn't just happen once, it's a continuous process. Development also looks at, is an end and a means in itself. By this I mean, for instance, take an example. If you go to school and you are educated, if you are an educated person, that is an end, you have achieved something. But you could use also education as a means, to achieve something, to maybe get a better job and get employed. And therefore its education in that case could be a means, but an end in itself. And therefore that's it, that's development. Development can be about positive change, transformational change. You are achieving better, okay, good life, better good life, or something like that. You get a good job, and then you get a good vehicle, or you buy a plot of land and then you build. So positive change. It's also about progress, in other words, well-being. It's about overcoming poverty. The more you beat poverty, or you reduce it or eliminate it, then the way you are considered to be developing. It's about reducing or eliminating gaps between social groups, such as between the adults and the young, or women and men, or those that are those that are in rural or urban. Okay, so it's about bridging the gap between the developed nations and the developing societies. It's universal, it takes place in any society, any time, and it deals with any issues that are happening in any society. But all these changes in processes, transformational change or bridging gap or whatever, all of it is based on the actions of actors, the NGOs, the donors, the state. Yeah, so at a later stage, in some other session, we are going to look generally specifically concentrate on the development actors, and we shall look at this in details. Okay, so all these process cannot happen without the actions of different actors. Okay, so you could see a summary of what development is in Imran Hussein's video. I've provided this in Moodle. You can check it out and watch it. Or if you can't visit our Moodle page and you're watching this, you could visit this on YouTube, on this page and this link, and then you watch what he talks about. He gives a summary of what I've just talked about above. So then the other opposite of development is equated to underdevelopment. If you are not developed, then you are underdeveloped. And usually they look at the absence of characteristics of modern economic growth and these other development aspects that we talked about. Okay, in the first that I experienced in the first world, such as Europe or China or Japan or the US. And underdevelopment is usually looked at as experienced in the developing nations such as Africa, Asia, Latin America, and so on. Okay, and of course later on we shall be looking at the reasons why some nations and others are developed or not developed. So the question is, why is it that some nations or some countries or some areas within your countries, in Uganda, in Angola, in Ghana, in Nigeria, in Congo, in Kenya, in whatever kind of country, why is it that some areas or some households or some individuals are developed while others are not developed? And we begin with, for instance, the globe picture. So you can see, for instance, the categorization of countries that are developed while others are not developed. So you will see our legend is here, our key is here. Those in dark blue are developed countries or first world countries. Those that are in light blue are transiting from being developing countries to developed countries. Those that are in cream, or you could call it yellow, are developing countries. And those that are in some kind of orange or so are transiting from being poor countries, or least developed countries, to developing countries, or middle developed countries. And then others don't have data yet. Okay, so those that are in red, and you can see Africa is beautifully painted in red, and some parts of South Asia and so on, including Vietnam. You can see Vietnam here, and so on. So you can see, for instance, the US and some, of course, European countries, all European countries, almost all European, Western Europe, Western Europe here, Western Europe countries, and of course Australia and some parts of South America, including Chile and Peru and so on, or Argentina and so on. I think Chile, yeah, and Peru are doing well in terms of, they are considered developed countries. And then you have Russia and some other countries here and there are coming up to become also developed countries. And then you have these creamy for instance, you have Brazil, you have Mexico, you have Algeria, Tunisia, Libya, and so Egypt. You have Nigeria, South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, and others, including Ghana and so on. Then you come to Asia, you have India. You have most countries in the Middle East and so on, including even China. All those are regarded as coming transiting as developing countries that are almost transiting to developing countries. Then you have, for instance, Angola and so on that are actually now transiting to developing countries. They are no longer regarded as least developed countries or poor countries, and therefore different from these that are reddish. Okay, majority of them are in Africa: Somalia, Uganda, South Sudan, Central African Republic, uh, Niger, and Zimbabwe, Zambia, and so on, Congo, Madagascar, Lesotho, and so on, all looked at as developing countries. Vietnam and the neighboring countries, and so on. So considered as as least developed countries, or in other words, let me put it bluntly, poor countries, very poor countries. Okay, so this is according to the global standard. Okay, by 2019, you can visit this, and you'll get the picture. Okay, then so that was global. Now let's come to Africa, to our own. Okay, because most of you in this class are from African countries. Okay, so why are some African countries or some African areas developed? Sorry. Okay, there's a grammatical error here. I have to correct. Okay. Okay, so this was global, and we asked why are some countries developed. Okay, so why are some countries developed than others, and why are African countries or areas developed than others? And of course, you have your Africa here. So here we looked at it, and most of it is actually looking badly in terms of development. So why is it that some are more developed while others are not? So you have, for instance, the scale is right here, and the more red you are, the more developed you are. The more bluish you are, the more poor you are, and the more yellowish or orange or gray or creamish you are, the more or less you are developed. So on average, so you can see, for instance, if we start from the top, Equatorial Guinea and Algeria and others take the top. Those are rich countries in Africa, if I may say. So rich countries in Africa, moving from upscale to downscale. So you have Algeria, you have Equatorial Guinea, more developed, is the most developed country in Africa so far. Okay, so far. So you have Equatorial Guinea, and then followed by Algeria, with Gabon. Of course, Gabon should be more developed considering the more resources they have. And then you have Seychelles, then you have Mauritius, you have and those other countries, and then you have Botswana. Botswana is doing well, by the way. Yeah, it is. Senegal would be doing well. I don't know why, but yeah, we'll have some set of factors and so on. Because it has at least been stable with Botswana compared to other countries after independence, as we shall look at it in more at colonialism and independence in the next session. And then so you have Egypt following, and Tunisia, and then South Africa and Namibia all following. And then after that, you have other the middle or average developed countries, including Libya, Morocco, Western Sahara, which is occupied by Morocco. Then you have Nigeria and the Congo, I mean Congo Brazzaville, uh, and then you have Angola and so on, and then followed by Swaziland. So those are a little, a little bit richer compared to other countries. Then that is followed by of course Sudan with its oil. Yeah, they are doing well. Then Mauritania and so on, and then also of course others, Moite and so on. Then you have the yellowish, the Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Lesotho, and so on, doing so much a little bit better than others. Then following, you have, of course, the many. You have Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, Uganda, Rwanda, and Benin, Guinea, Senegal, Mali, Chad, Ethiopia, and so on. Those are also a little bit fair enough. And then as you move to the bottom, you have a combination of many. South Sudan, Niger, you have Burkina Faso, Togo, Guinea-Bissau, the Gambia, Sierra Leone, Madagascar, Mozambique, Malawi, not doing so much well, including Eritrea, not doing so much well, but better than some, better than Liberia, which was occupied, which is an occupant of the slaves from America, as we shall see later on. You have Somalia, which is always, of course, tainted with civil wars. Then you have Central Republic, and then DRC, and so on. So as you can see, Central Republic, DRC, and Somalia have some commonalities. Civil wars. Could it be that they are those that they are the one that civil wars are causing such high poverty levels in their countries also? Why? But in Liberia, if we are to compare, Liberia is also the same, in the same scale, but there are no wars. So there are other factors. Okay. So like I was saying, there are many factors that are influencing how different nations or different communities are. If we had a bigger way of a better way of dissecting also, for instance, way dissecting the Congo, you will, on a scale of areas that are rich, that are not rich, you will see that also in Congo itself as a country, while it is generally looked at economically as a poor country, GDP, as I was saying earlier on, this kind of measurement, or this picture of, or this coloring is based on the GDP per capita. It is based on goods and services produced by each country. Okay, but you will find if we were to dissect DRC, you will find that there are areas that are more richer than other areas. Okay, so that's the problem of with generalization that I was talking about. Yeah. So this is 2020. Okay, by the top 20 channel, the top 10 channel, it does some kind of comparisons. Okay, so by 2020 you see that Somalia is doing worse while Seychelles is doing well. Okay, so this is what I was talking about. For instance, Seychelles here, see, is among the richest countries in Africa. And here, you see it here on top. Okay, and then Somalia is doing very way badly. Yeah, but if you visit YouTube, for instance, yeah, please visit this YouTube. You will see how things have been changing over time, and that will show you what I was talking about by the definition of development, or development dimensions, or development itself as a process, and it keeps changing, and therefore you have keeps changing from place to place, from time to time. Okay, and this, if you watch this short video, it will show you how different countries have been changing. For instance, the numbers shifting that for instance, in 1970s, Kenya maybe was the fifth. Maybe it has changed by 2018. So it will show you how things have been changing, and you will see how the GDP for countries has been changing. Okay, depending on different factors, of course. Yeah. So again, why are some countries or areas developed than others? Big question, eh? Let that think in. Just let that sink in your brains. Think about it. But Diamond 2003 looks at guns, the history of why European countries, or the US and so on, and Russia and China, Japan are more developed than those that are in the tropic, African countries and so on. So his idea is based on geography, that the locations of certain countries define their development over a period of time. This is versus Acemoglu and Robinson 2012, asking why nations fail. And Acemoglu and Robinson say that no, it is not about geography, it is not about location, but rather the institutions. The institutions, how rules and the rules and norms in a certain country help to develop or underdevelop a certain area. Okay, so some countries are more developed than others because of tropical climate and labor productivity, or climate or landlockedness, or agricultural technology, or human or animal health. And Gerard Diamond gives you some insights. You'll watch the videos that I have embedded in the Moodle page to get more idea of what is happening. But according to Jared, for instance, says that, for instance, in the tropical climate harbors insects such as mosquitoes that carry deadly diseases such as malaria, and therefore malaria makes people sick, and therefore they cannot be more productive, and therefore cannot produce more goods and services, and therefore leads to their underdevelopment. So climate and so on. Also, Gerard says, Diamond or geography. In this case, when we're looking at geography as a point of why some countries are developed, others are developed, the countries that are on the coasts are more developed than the countries that are within the inner continental. Okay, an example, if we compare this, of course, for some countries it wouldn't be necessarily like that, but if you compare, for instance, Kenya and Tanzania, they are more developed than Rwanda and Uganda, because Uganda is more landlocked than others, but Kenya has Mombasa, where we all have to go. You see trucks going to Mombasa, Kenya. Yeah, to the coast to look for, to get goods that have been brought by sea. Okay, so that's what they mean by landlockedness. And then agricultural technology and so on. The other one is institution, by what Asemoglu and Robinson are talking about, that the rules, the way institutions operate in terms of politics and economic systems define how a certain area would be developed. For instance, if political institutions are corrupt, such as the majority in Africa, that would constrain how certain development processes would go about. For instance, money that is gotten from taxes that would be reinvested in the economy is swindled by our leaders and therefore taken outside Africa, and that is why mostly African countries are underdeveloped. Extractive versus inclusive institutions. For instance, you have institutions that are more dealing in getting resources out of Africa and taking them outside. For instance, if you compare during colonialism, so Asemoglu and Robinson compare colonial institutions in countries where colonizers were settling in countries, and therefore they established better institutions, and therefore you find those countries are more developed. Take an example of US. Okay, while in countries where where uh, settlers, or where colonizers did not settle and were just extracting raw materials, such as in Africa, take an example of DRC, where the Belgians were just getting resources out of DRC and taking them to Belgium. In those countries, the institutions were not strong, and therefore that is why such countries are still poor, because their establishment of institutions that are more extractive than inclusive. Okay. Culture and social structures. Religion and wealth or social capital, such as religious beliefs and superstitions, also influence development, and therefore bring underdevelopment in certain countries where there are high levels of religious beliefs and superstitions. Okay, so one problem, for instance, I have with most Ugandans, those who go to church from morning up to evening. Okay, you are praying to God. Yes, you're praying to God, but God also needs you to go and work. Okay, even the Bible itself says it. Faith without action is dead. Yeah, so the conservation and literacy. also matters. People who don't believe in education, uh, in most cases, do not actually achieve. But of course, does not necessarily mean that it's education alone, because there are people who have not attained education but they are rich. So they are all mix of factors. Then freedom, power and inequalities, from global to regional, national to community, or individual to individual. See, at global level, there are the countries such as Russia or US or other European countries suppress the other countries that are poor, especially countries in Africa. You don't do this, don't do this, we are going to put sanctions on you, and so on. You can't do this. So those are global inequalities, and the superpowers constrain development of the developing countries, the poor countries, such as those in Africa. That is such kind of power inequalities and so on also happen in our own communities, where you have, or even at individual level or at household level. That's where you have, for instance, in most cases, you have men more developed compared to women who are more poor, because men have more bargaining power and take more decisions compared to women. Okay, so power and inequalities also matter. Lack of intellectual or political or economic or religious or cultural freedom. Okay, that is very important. So you can check the freedom index that looks at political participation. Is everyone does everyone have equal rights to participate, or others are suppressed? Are suppressed. Then you have property rights, the legal systems, the land tenure system. Who owns land? Can you be able to use it? Take an example. Again, I compare men and women. Take an example. While women can use in rural areas, can use, or in urban areas, can access land to use it for digging and cultivation, they do not own that land, and therefore lack of ownership, for instance, can limit them from using such land as collateral in the bank to access loans to be able to reinvest in other businesses. So property rights matter. Okay. Then you have external factors such as colonialism, history. We are looking at this in the next session. We shall look at colonialism in details, and how it has influenced, it has impacted Africa in a long run. Okay, then there is global capitalism and international, of course, competition for others. So you have these videos. I have also embedded them in the Moodle. You can watch them and get a summary of what we just talked about. Defining development, and why, for instance, why some countries are still poor while others are more developed. Bottom line is that development is contested, it's complex, it's ambiguous, it's multidimensional, it's all those. There is no universal or single definition of development. The definition varies from person to person, it varies from place to place, it varies from time to time. But of course, depending on the different factors that influence such changes. Okay? So the definition depends on who defines it and the ideological basis for their definition. Again, think about the differences in terms of thinking between the other pastoralist and the guy who lives in urban center, or the educated person and the uneducated person. Think about those. Some references that could help you. You don't have to read all of them, you can sort some, but I just have to provide them for your reference. So that marks the end of the session. Thank you.